Surveillance capitalism and the metaphysics of presence. The relation between a person who receives the most elementary of coordinates, such as a telephone number, address, etc., and the one who gives it, is always, even at its most simplistic level, a twofold exercise in the act of trust. Why is this so? Because even after you have received whatever figure or GPS position on the map, you still assume, or rather believe, A, that the address provided is the right one, and B, that it is really the location or number of the person who you may have been communicating with. This, or rather the apprehension of this before we leap into the fray, as it were, is important, irrespective of whether we decide to go or not, because it replicates at its most elementary level the split between the signifier and the signified at its surface, concerning the address provided and its referent. However, there is an added level of meaning here which the Saussurean distinction does not take into account, and that is that the coordinates concerned are those of the person who we sought or believed we were interacting with. In other words, we believe we were not lied to. Why would anyone choose to mislead us is obviously too naive a question to ask on a public portal. But are we even aware of the coordinates within which what we count as perception, pure and simple, are themselves misleading, even as we believe them? This, I claim, is the structure of surveillance capitalism operational today. Like an Eskimo with a fishing rod by a hole in the ice from the cartoons of our yesteryears, public social media platforms such as LinkedIn, for example, post tens of thousands, if not millions of jobs on their platform every day. An applicant to one of these positions is not merely a person who believes that there is such a job that the advertisement claims to be hiring for, let us say a secretarial position in a magazine, office, or whatever. But more importantly, the purpose of the advertisement is to hire an individual applicant as such, and not, for example, merely to act as a kind of sponge or curriculum vitae which fit a certain profile that the company in question claims to be hiring for. In other words, what I am claiming here is that the possibility of fishing for a job today really is a way in which a company may be presenting a front for a few underemployed employees, for example, who may be posting tasteless advertisements so that the platform which holds them can effectively function with a degree of legitimacy and perhaps allow two or more companies to coordinate their wares and functioning so that in the end nothing really ever gets done. But is this true only for social media platforms, for instance? What, for example, do we learn about the executive enactment and repealment of the Farm Bill laws in India within the span of a year, in a rare act where the Supreme Court of India actually exercised its autonomy? The deregularization of mandis as the only place where agricultural produce could be sold effectively opened up the market and allowed large retailers to compete with such local markets by other means than buying in large bulks. The introduction of contract farming and their regularization would permit for the standardization which would help manufacturers in terms of quantities, qualities, and seasons, etc. The terms of agreement between a buyer and farmer, however, should potentially be regularized to keep at bay exploitative practices. The deregulation of caps on stocks which retailers can keep before selling to consumers would potentially problematize practices of hoarding already at work in the country, which often lead to the waste of stockpiled food grains. These coordinates are indeed what the conditions of techno-feudalism are, which have been raised by leaders such as Yanis Varoufakis, the ex-finance minister of Greece and presently a member of the European Parliament. The conditions of platform capitalism, which were raised earlier as a form of digital exploitation, which we do not know is happening or is happening even with our willing consent, in the form of profiles registered on social media platforms such as LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter, effectively provides companies who trade in data, such as Reliance, for example, with indicators of our preferences and browsing habits, which they sell to manufacturers for money. Twitter, for instance, has reported that 13% of its income, sorry, plugging in the laptop. Twitter, for instance, has reported that 13% of its income is from the sale of data, mostly in the form of access to its application programming interface. And I presume this is where they post their advertisements, on the right-hand column. Reliance, however, the leader in terms of market share, in terms of the sale of data in cellular devices in India, has recently expanded into the Indian supermarket industry with chains of Reliance Trends and Reliance Fresh, which stock groceries and agricultural produce. This is a situation where companies like this are sold your data, which you upload on platforms to companies who can specialize the kind of advertisement you see and who also are making forays into the supermarket industry, regulating the prices of commodities which are purchased by the average customer, who are slowly migrating, as it were, from mandis to supermarkets in any case. This farming of our very interaction is the situation which sociologists name surveillance capitalism, and it has serious implications to any possible understanding of the question of agency in this world. My question here is, how are we to understand the question of the metaphysics of presence today? What does it mean, for instance, for the average moderator of a group or page on Facebook who regulates the kind of comments which can and cannot be made? A scenario not very different in principle from the position of the mother at a dining table at home, be when the interaction and posts made by users form what is effectively the bread and butter which many household economies run on. Indeed, is this job not very different in principle from the work of a newspaper editor at a good publication from yesteryears? Perhaps with the added benefit that instead of collating facts and framing stories, this moderator merely screens comments, posts, and pictures for spam, self-promotion, and abusive behavior. This position, indeed, is the new warden, as it were, whose role, watered down as it may, is not even to run a program or regulate timings of any kind, but merely to screen for impropriety. And suddenly it appears that we are back amidst Victorian England and the tea bag party all over again. Make no mistake, this is what neocolonialism looks like, and it is as real as the fruit in the market, the air conditioned shop you buy it from, and the cell phone you may have in your pocket. Should we hence be surprised that recently the Supreme Court of India, in another judgment which seems to keep abreast of the times and conditions we are in, added to our fundamental rights the right to privacy? The dissolution of privacy itself is not something that I think is a regressive measure in any society which can hold its customs with a sense of pride, where there may be a free and independent press, for example, and where children are educated in schools which are inclusive in ways that can pass down the mores and findings which have been the product of earlier investigations. What is disturbing about the present violation of our privacy, if you want to call it a violation, that is, would be the fact that this information is being used to fund platforms which are often worth more than most of the countries in the world. It is not merely about the money which such platforms make, but the fact that the number of profiles which these platforms host provide them the opportunity to conduct what is recognizable today as social engineering. And this does not disprivilege earlier forms of organization as much as plug into the most banal dimensions of them, as their insecurities about profiling, be it racial, linguistic, national, or along any other ethnic or political orientation. This construction of a self, as it were, an activity which we have been engaged in since the dawn of privacy at least, even if the day of that idea is done, or so it may seem presently, has been digitalized and made into fragments of usable data of interest to your bank and credit card companies, for example, but also the local government, peer associations who may be setting up businesses, rivals, partners, and others in ways which our own mediations, such as the presenting of the front of a shop and the security which may have been entailed in owning it, seems to have withered away, so to speak. I am not sure whether this in itself would be entirely a bad thing, or it would make an emerging generation more circumspect about what they may choose to share, just as this very apprehension may create slightly more frigid relations, which indeed may lead to a lack of trust in institutions and markets in terms of new enterprise. But is this not the same as what the essence of austerity has always been? In which way would I mean this? Well, the withdrawal of investment in public infrastructure and monetary measures such as the stimulus for the economy that a government may choose to withdraw from has always borne such effects. Rarely are such periods remembered kindly, even if some writers such as P. Sainath, for instance, may title their work sarcastically. Here I am referring to his first book, Everybody Loves a Good Drought. What a longer term development which this reconfiguration of how we see ourselves in the world, which really does move at the push of a button, would be perhaps pages such as forums in a website becoming a repository for useful index specific information, be it in terms of bodybuilding, which I believe may have been the first of such pages, to electronic toys, political leads, and any other such indulgences. that may be taken an interest in these days. But in entirety, this does seem to be signaling something of an end, if this term is used with the tentativeness and care that it deserves, of what very many public institutions seem to have been in yesteryears, be it banks, schools, supermarkets, or shops, many of whom may be accessed today via screens while browsing their wares, and whose inventories are resupplied via tabulated records kept electronically and shared as orders when stocks may be required. This brings us to the question of the metaphysics of presence, and here is where I think we would be witnessing the most decisive changes in terms of what is the terrain and texture of social experience that may be surfacing today, when information is really not a scarcity, even if the courage to express it seems threatened in some situations. You would recall that the group Anonymous, which served as a cover for the voicing of political dissent, I think it is evident that the ubiquity of identity, which is seemingly the inverse of anonymity, effectively serves the same blanketing mechanism, where a voice, as it were, is liberated as if as it has the safety of numbers and the luxury of not being accountable for their acts, deeds, and words individually. And here I think we can see why the position of the moderator of a page may have been instituted on platforms such as Facebook in the first place. This is indeed a public sphere which is less afraid, that is more outspoken, and in these terms better equipped to pass on experiences to an emerging horizon that will not experience the world in the ways in which we have, even if certain continuities appear and others seek new ways to entrench themselves. The construction of canons, indeed, is often a way in which not a past per se, as much as a tradition, is retroactively constructed as a means via which a people may identify themselves and come together, I suppose, over anything from football or movies or indeed literature, which would be what I opt for, speaking as a former shy kid. But it is also clear that there are ways in which this quickening of our communications, as it were, does seem to present to us less time to consider precisely what is it that may be said, and a quicker interpretation does tend to identify threats and violence in ways which a sober discussion would tend to wean away. And here I think we can identify certain structural features implemented on social media platforms such as Twitter, which highlight emerging trends with a hashtag which anyone can open as an index and perhaps place their own spin on any recent development, maybe perhaps reducing their digital identity to some kind of signature, which perhaps some may even interpret as an artwork. And these are often the most explicitly political projections. The question which emerges is, where does this leave the family of yesteryears? And it would be easy to dismiss this issue as a retreat into a new form of interest in real estate, and perhaps the question of class being displaced to an extent to that of proximity with the neighbor, who becomes perhaps a less theological figure and more like a presence who we recognize in terms of their relation to an abode, a paradoxical feature as never has mobility been as exaggerated as the present seems to hold. A fact that governments seem to have responded to in recent years with increasingly isolationist measures safeguarding their borders.